Senator.
What about the post, you remember December 10th, 2020, where you said that you were hoping that President Trump would have his vetoes overridden, and you agreed with the post that he was a weak policy president? Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
What about you?
Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shogan, when you were here last year, a number of senators asked you, including me, a series of questions about articles you'd written, public statements you had made on social media that were, I have to say, pretty grossly partisan, and I thought offensive, and you and I went back and forth about it. After that, a number of us asked you questions for the record relating to these statements. I want to follow up on one of them. I, in particular, asked you to give us a full accounting of the public posts that you had made on Twitter. You had locked your Twitter account before you came before this committee. It had previously been public. I asked you to provide the public posts that had previously been available on Twitter because the ones that we have were pretty disturbing. You responded as follows, and I quote, "My personal Twitter account is comprised of posts about my mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog," end quote. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
I just remind you you're under oath. Is this an accurate statement?
Yes, Senator.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your Twitter posts then that I was asking you about. On February 18th, 2022, you posted on Twitter bemoaning the dropping of mask requirements for children, including those under the age of 5. Do you remember that post?
No, Senator. Those tweets were in my personal capacity.
No. I asked you, would you give all public posts that you had made on Twitter? You said no, effectively, and you said that your Twitter posts consisted of mystery novels, events at the White House Historical Association, Pittsburgh sports teams, travels, and my dog. And you just told me now under oath that you stood by that. So now let's talk about your Twitter posts. On February 18th, 2022, you posted bemoaning the fact that mask requirements for children under the age of 5, one of whom I happen to have, by the way, had been dropped. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams?
My social media is in my personal capacity,
Answer
Senator.
my question, please, because you've testified under oath that you only posted about your dog and sports teams and novels, and you also said you wouldn't give this committee any of your public posts. So, is your post on February 18th, 2022, bemoaning the lifting of mask requirements for children under the age of 5, who I might just ask, all of the data has said is extremely harmful to children, these mask requirements? We'll leave that aside for now. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams? Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
Yes or no, Ms. Shogan? You are under oath before this committee, and I have to say, you have placed this issue squarely in record by repeatedly refusing to answer. Yes or no?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
So you're not answering my question. Let's talk about another post. 26th of May, 2022. You talk about an assault weapons ban, retweet a post, ban assault weapons now. Say you agree with this idea that you have to be a certain age to buy so-called assault weapons in America. Is that a post about sports teams or your dog or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post on January 5th of 2021 in which you say that Ted Cruz ought to stay in his own lane and not worry about what's going on in Pittsburgh? This is a reference, I think, to questions he had about the certification of the last election. Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post, you remember December 10th, 2020, where you said that you were hoping that President Trump would have his vetoes overridden, and you agreed with the post that he was a weak policy president? Is that a post about your dog or sports teams or mystery novels?
My social media is in my personal capacity.
What about your post on January 5th, 2021, in which you speculated that President Trump would pardon himself next, participating in a conversation about the certification of the Electoral College? Is that a post about sports teams or mystery novels or your work at the White House Historical Association?
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
What about the post? Do you remember this one? I said we seem to be having an incredible case of amnesia, but maybe you remember this one. This is from December 3rd of 2021, in which you advise an individual who goes by Meg on social media that the Library of Congress, you advise this person to complain about religious flags that have been planted on the grounds of the Library of Congress, and you say that they ought to be removed. And you go on to give this person advice about how to complain and have them removed. Do you remember that post?
My social media is in my personal
Do you remember the post?
capacity. My
Do you
social
remember
media is
the
in
post?
my personal capacity, Senator.
I have to say, I have been here for 4 years in the Senate. I have never seen a witness stonewall like this before. Never. And I've seen a lot. This is extraordinary. Do you remember this post? December 3rd, 2021.
My social media is in my personal capacity, Senator.
I mean, this is unbelievable. And you want to be the archivist of the United States. You lied to us under oath. You lied to us in your QFRs. You just lied to me a second ago under oath. And now you're sitting here stonewalling, not answering questions about public posts that you've made. Are you a lawyer, Ms. Shogan?
No, Senator.
Are you familiar with the Shirtliff case at the United States Supreme Court?
No, Senator, I'm not.
Well, in that case, the Supreme Court held that, in fact, it constitutes viewpoint discrimination for a government entity to remove religious flags from its property when it's opened up the property to allow other people to put flags on it. Exactly the question that you were addressing in your public posts on Twitter. You're giving legal advice, which you're not qualified to give, directly contrary to the United States Supreme Court. I just wonder, does this have to do with your view that you wrote about that the religious right is connected to the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics? Is that why you said what you said about religious flags, that the religious right is a force for anti-intellectualism? Explain that to me.
No, Senator.
Do you stand by your comment that the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics?
Senator, that article was written. It was about how Republican presidents use common sense terminology to effectively communicate with Americans.
Yeah, in which you said that the religious right, the rise of the religious right is part of the rise of anti-intellectualism in American politics. I just point out that's the article in which you say anti-intellectual, the title is Anti-Intellectualism in the Modern Presidency, Republican Populism. Very nonpartisan. Dr. Shogan, I'm going to ask you again, will you give to this committee your public posts on Twitter? Will you make them available to this
My
committee?
social media is in my personal capacity.
Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you, this is the most extraordinary thing I have seen in my brief time in the Senate. I have never seen a witness blatantly lie under oath like Dr. Shogan has just done to this committee, stonewalled this committee, and just repeatedly refused to answer my questions about her own posts that are in public. For these reasons, I will oppose your nomination, and I strongly, strongly urge this committee to take action on this and force this witness to own up to the fact that she is misleading us right now before our eyes, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks. Shogun, Dr. Shogun, why don't you take a minute and just to respond to some of what we've heard from Senator Hawley, please? And I promise not to interrupt you.
Thank you, Senator. I would like to highlight my nonpartisan record that I have achieved for the past 15 years in service, in public service. 8 years at the Congressional Research Service, 4 years at the Library of Congress, and the past 3 years at the nonpartisan White House Historical Association. I have worked very effectively with Republicans and Democrats in all of these capacities. When I worked at the Congressional Research Service, I worked with hundreds of members of Congress and senators, committees, majority and minority alike, walked into offices, helped them get from point A to point B, regardless of their partisan affiliation. In my current job at the White House Historical Association, I came to the White House Historical Association. I accepted the position late 2019, started the job in early 2020, and when President Trump was the President of the United States, worked very effectively with that White House, and then of course now with President Biden in the White House, I've worked very effectively with that White House. So I stand very strongly behind my professional, nonpartisan record, which I think speaks for itself.
With the information we just heard from my colleague, is this official? Is this like government emails? What? I don't really understand the source of them. Just explain it.
No, social media in my personal capacity as marked as such.
Okay. Be interesting to see what social media in our personal capacity look like for some of the folks that we serve with. And so I thank you for setting the record straight. I want to begin by thank you for joining us for today's hearing and for your willingness to serve our country. I'm a veteran, last Vietnam veteran serving here, especially appreciative of the work in that regard. But over the last decade, the National Archives and Records Administration has been putting together the tools to transition the federal government from paper to electronic records. And as the chief administrator of NARA, the archivist plays a critical leadership role in the transition, as you know, to digital records, and providing appropriate support to staff will be crucial in the success of the transition. Here's my question. With that said, what administrative or policy changes would you implement at NARA in order to ensure the agency has the appropriate resources to carry out this transition from paper to digital? And how will you ensure the staff has the support and training that they need to efficiently accomplish this feat?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. It is a very big challenge for NARA moving forward, the transition from predominantly analog to a predominantly digital archive. The first challenge, I think, Senator, will be that paper records aren't going anywhere. Paper records have existed since the beginning of the Republic. So as the transition moves to digital records after June 30th, 2024, when the OMB directive is implemented, the National Archives will still have to deal with paper records while they transition. So to use a sports analogy, if you're a good basketball player, you have to be able to play offense and defense. And the National Archives will have to be able to also serve paper records while they make the transition to digital. So that will be the first challenge. The second challenge, I think, Senator, will be that when those digital records come to the National Archives, the question will be, are the agencies providing the correct data that accompanies those records? Because as you might imagine, there's going to be an exponential increase in the number of digital records compared to analog or paper records. So what will really matter is that if the accompanying data with those records will help our users find the records that they need. So I think that's going to be a major challenge. Going forward, the archives, we will need to provide correct training for staff because just as I said before, the records have increased exponentially, but the budget has not increased exponentially. So staff needs to be trained to be able to make this transition from paper to digital, and there will be different requirements for things like metadata. And we can rely upon a very strategic use of training to be able to make sure staff are ready for that transition. And once again, being able to continue the servicing of the paper records while NARA becomes a predominantly digital agency.
All right, thank you. One more question. Dealing with the ability of the National Archives to adapt to advancements in record-keeping technology. And in 2014, under my leadership as chairman of this committee at the time, I think with Tom Coburn as my wingman, we passed the Presidential and Federal Records Act, which, among other things, certified that electronic records should be treated the same way as paper records. As a result of that clarification, NARA has seen an increase in the volume of records that they are required to collect and to preserve. These records document the important work of our federal workforce conducts on a daily basis and need to be properly collected and preserved. As such, NARA requires the resources to ensure that proper protocols are in place to collect and maintain both paper and electronic records. Question. Dr. Shogan, how do you see NARA being able to adapt to advancements in record-keeping technology to collect and preserve both paper and electronic records? And do you feel NARA has the resources to do that while responding to record requests?
Thank you for that question. As I said in the previous answer, this is going to be the challenge to be able to continue to service paper records as well as moving forward with the advancement to digital. And I think the answer to that, Senator, is that the federal agencies that are, of course, providing the records, whether they're paper or digital, need to engage earlier in the process. And this will be NARA's responsibility to provide education and oversight to those agencies to get them to engage earlier in the process so that their technologies and their data, once again, will meet the needs for our users. I do not come to this as an archivist by training, but I do come to this as a user of the National Archives, and I look forward to bringing that perspective as a user to the National Archives as we move forward into the digital future.
Thank you. All of us on this committee and in the Senate and the House receive inquiries from our constituents. A lot of them are veterans, and the issues that are raised are veterans, and I'm especially interested in seeing us be able to provide better responses in that regard. Thank you so much for your willingness to serve in this role. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions, and welcome once again to the committee. We'd love having you here.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Glad to be here, and welcome, Dr. Shogan. We're glad you're here as well. Dr. Shogan, as you know, over 1 million Americans and over 10 million people worldwide have died from COVID. Recently, the Department of Energy released information that they've changed their mind, and they believe that this virus originated in Wuhan, China, joining our own FBI. Earlier, you committed to Ranking Member Paul to try and declassify older records. Do you feel that America deserves to know the origins of COVID, and will you do everything possible to declassify these recent records, including why the Department of Energy changed their mind?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. It's nice to meet you, and welcome to the committee. We didn't have a chance to chat before. Senator, as I understand it, the agencies that classify records also hold the responsibility to declassify those records. So that would not be in the direct purview of the Archivist of the United States. But nonetheless, at the National Archives, there is a principal value is a value of transparency. So I will be responsive to any requests that you might have while following the law. And of course, in areas of classification, you know, finding the appropriate balance between transparency and, of course, critically protecting our national security.
I want to talk for a moment about the storage of data done from research funded with United States dollars and how you feel your role would be in this. In September of 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology terminated access to an important database that was populated with genomic sequences resulting in part or from United States-sponsored research. We still don't have access to that data. Similarly, in 2020, the WIV removed genomic data stored at our own NIH Genomic Lab Bank here in this country. What are your plans to require hosting of data for U.S.-sponsored research in the United States? And what are your plans to pursue any type of punitive actions against the Wuhan Institute of Virology for terminating access to our data paid for with U.S. dollars?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I'm not familiar with some of the facts that you have just explained to me, that I have not been briefed about those matters, but if I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, I promise that I will look into those matters. I'm happy to meet with you or meet with your staff to follow up on those matters.
Do you believe that if the U.S. is funding that type of research, that it should be transparent, it should be stored, it should be available to the public?
I believe that all agencies must follow the requirements and dictates in the Federal Records Act.
Okay. In 2017, it was discovered that the NIH was deleting records. While a number of those records have been fully or partially recovered, many have not. NARA has acknowledged receipt of an NIH report about the record deletion, but to my knowledge, has not been made public. Are you aware of this report or the subject of the deleted files, and are you willing to submit them to this committee for further review?
Senator, I've not been briefed. I'm not privy to those details, but I will be responsive to you under the requirements of the law, for sure.
And will you make those records available to this committee, if not publicly?
If I am confirmed, I will follow the dictates required in the Federal Records Act and all associated regulations, Senator.
Okay. Kind of change subjects here for a second. Last Congress, I was shocked to find out that the National Archives had and continues to label our founding documents as containing trigger warnings. That's right, the National Archives on their website states that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights contains harmful content. I introduced legislation with Senator Risch to remove these designations and would like to understand your personal opinion on our founding documents and the role of the National Archives in sharing them with our citizens. Do you believe personally that the Constitution and our founding documents are harmful?
Senator, absolutely not.
Do you think we should remove that warning label, that there are trigger warnings there?
Senator, there is a harmful content warning, but it is on all results when you use the NARA's online catalog. It is not attached to any one record, such as the United States Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. Previously, when I testified before this committee, I did state, I believe to Senator Lankford, that I would be willing to work with him about the language of that warning. And I stand behind my promise to do so if I am confirmed.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Ranking Member Paul had 2 minutes left in his time that he graciously passed to allow members to speak. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
You know, I was favorably inclined by your answers, particularly that your role as the archivist is ministerial with regard to certifying amendments to the Constitution. Also, on your, I think, forthright answer on the, whether or not you'd force people to cover their T-shirts. And I thought those were great responses. I guess I'm a little bit sort of torn, though, with the whole idea of that, your Twitter is private. We tell our kids it's not, and be careful what you post on Twitter. Everybody knows that. And so the problem is that, see, if I have an intern in my office, we actually do look at their Twitter. And if they say bad things about people's ethnicity or their private life, they make sort of aspersions or act as if they're bigoted in any way, we won't hire them as an intern, much less as a person. So, this is advice for everybody. You got to really be careful what you post. Now, being a liberal should not disqualify you. But the one question on whether or not, the Library of Congress should take down flags does kind of go to the heart of what we would do with records and things, and whether or not, that shows a bias that might enter into the decision-making, as an archivist. And so it does worry me. Not that you're liberal. I mean, that doesn't, I think if we got rid of liberals, we might not have a lot of librarians or archivists, frankly. But I am worried about the idea that you would, advise people at the Library of Congress about, taking down religious flags in a public place. I think it goes against the law, but then in not answering the actual issue, and I know it's difficult in a cross-examination to decide, but by not answering the subject about religious flags, it worries me that what we're getting is a public place as opposed to, what you say in private, which may not meld together. Do you have any comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for that question. If I am confirmed as Archivist of the United States, without reservation, I will welcome all Americans to the National Archives. I will welcome them enthusiastically to the National Archives. I stand 100% behind that sentiment. I have a record of doing so at the Library of Congress, where I oversaw visitor services for several years, and I will continue in that tradition. And you have my promise and my word on that.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Shogan, good to see you again. And I congratulate you again on your nomination. You and I have discussed this issue previously, so you won't be surprised to hear that I'm eager to hear again your commitments to work with me to address the significant delays that veterans are experiencing accessing their service records. As you know, Dr. Shogan, to access their VA benefits and other services to which they're entitled as veterans, veterans need access to the military service records, which are in the custody of the archives. And the good news is that with Chairman Peters' support, last year I introduced and passed into law the Bipartisan Access for Veterans to Records Act in order to address the serious backlog of requests for access to military service records. And in your hearing last September, you committed to working with my office to address that backlog. So I want to ask you again, now that my bipartisan legislation is law, will you commit to working with me swiftly to eliminate the backlog of veterans' record requests at NPRC?
Senator, thank you for that question. Absolutely.
What is your understanding of the latest state of that backlog? What efforts are underway now to address it? What do you think will need to be done if and when you assume this office in order to eliminate it?
Senator, I think there is good news in that regard. The backlog is down to about 330,000 requests. The height of the backlog was over 600,000 requests, so that is good progress. And the projected timeline for completion of the backlog or elimination of it is in December of 2023. And if I am confirmed, I promise to make my first trip as Archivist of the United States to St. Louis, to the National Personnel Records Center, to see the operations on the ground, to figure out where we can find efficiencies, to make sure that we are using contractual authorities to the highest extent, to make sure that work gets done in an expeditious fashion. And also to explore any other creative solutions where we might be able to move that deadline up. Although ambitious, December 2023, I think we could all agree we would like to have that sooner if possible.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan. And let's talk now about civil rights cold cases. Black Americans who, in the segregation era, were dragged from their homes, abducted, assaulted, lynched, subjected to horrific abuse and murder for which there was and remains impunity. Some of the most horrific crimes in our national history, they were never prosecuted. And the descendants and survivors of those victims are still with us. They rightfully demand justice. The good news is that we're making some progress toward securing justice. And last Congress, I passed into law the Bipartisan Civil Rights Cold Case Investigations Support Act to give the team tasked with investigating these civil rights cold cases the time they need to pursue justice. The archives have an important role to play in supporting those investigations. If you're confirmed, will you use your authorities to the fullest extent you can under the law to support those efforts to investigate civil rights cold cases, those unsolved lynching, those unsolved assaults and abductions from the segregation-era South?
Absolutely, Senator. I think that falls under the archive's priority of providing access to populations that need access to those records. We talked about veterans previously. That's, of course, so the veterans can claim their benefits. And in this instance, it's so that people can claim justice.
Thank you, Dr. Shogan. I have constituents who will be relieved to hear you make that commitment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.